Under the flickering glow of oil lamps, the night at a captured field hospital on Leyte Island was heavy with the scent of iodine and blood. Rain lashed the canvas roofs as the wind howled through shattered windows. Inside, rows of stretchers filled the floor, each one carrying the broken remnants of war. Japanese prisoners, American soldiers, and a few local civilians caught between them. The air trembled with the groans of pain and the murmurs of prayer. But amid that chaos, a quiet astonishment rippled among the Japanese nurses still present. Their captors, American medics in mud-soaked fatigues, were not torturing, mocking, or interrogating the wounded. Instead, they moved with methodical precision, voices calm, hands steady. They tended first to their own, stabilizing bleeding Americans under blinding lanterns, whispering encouragement before moving on to patch up the enemy. The nurses watched, confused and shaken, unsure whether this was mercy or madness. Only hours earlier, the same men had fought savagely outside these walls. The 7th Infantry Division had clawed its way through the jungle inch by inch, under relentless fire from entrenched Japanese defenders. When the gunfire finally died, the silence felt alien. The Americans advanced cautiously, clearing bunkers, pulling aside tarps, discovering that what had once been a Japanese military clinic was now filled with bodies and fading life. The surviving Japanese nurses stood rigid, expecting bayonets or bullets. Instead, they heard English words of reassurance, saw morphine syringes drawn not to end lives, but to ease them. One nurse later whispered, trembling, that she did not understand a war where the enemy cared for its wounded. The year was 1944. Across the Pacific, the war had turned into a storm of attrition. On Leyte, one of the bloodiest battles of the Philippines campaign, nearly 70,000 American troops faced over 50,000 Japanese defenders under General Tomoyuki Yamashita. Both sides knew what capture meant, or thought they did. The Imperial Japanese Army's indoctrination had drilled into its men and women that Americans were savages, desecrators, incapable of honor. Surrender was shame, mercy, an illusion. Yet what the nurses witnessed in that humid night contradicted everything they had been told since their first day in uniform. As stretcher after stretcher arrived, the American medics maintained an order that seemed almost inhuman, given the chaos outside. The triage line was clear. Their own men came first. The reasoning was military logic. Save those who could return to fight, those who could still move, those who had a chance. A sergeant barked orders as he stepped over puddles of blood, his uniform dark with rain. Prioritize ours, patch the artery, then check the prisoners. It wasn't cruelty. It was protocol. The Japanese nurses, trained under entirely different doctrines, could not comprehend it. In their culture of sacrifice, the individual meant nothing compared to the collective. Dying for one's country was the highest honor. Yet these Americans seemed obsessed with keeping each man alive, even the shattered ones, even when it meant using supplies that might never be replenished. For the Americans, this was not compassion alone, it was efficiency. Their entire medical corps had evolved into a machine of survival. From the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of the Pacific, field medics had learned that saving the wounded fast, often within an hour, the golden hour, meant preserving fighting strength. This philosophy, born from bitter experience, was backed by a logistical system unmatched in human history. Within hours, field hospitals like this one would radio requests for plasma, sulfur drugs, or blood units, and cargo planes from fleet carriers would deliver them. To the Japanese nurses, who had been forced to improvise with boiled water and torn cloth, it was nothing short of sorcery. Outside, the thunder rolled again, echoing through the shattered valley. The nurses, now under American guard, found themselves drawn into the rhythm of the medics' work. They handed instruments, cleaned wounds, whispered prayers to men they had once called devils. One of them, a young nurse from Osaka named Midori, hesitated when an American medic guided her toward a table where a severely burned Marine gasped for air. His skin was blistered, his face unrecognizable. Midori froze. The medic's voice was calm. "Hold the bottle steady." "That's it. You're helping him breathe." She obeyed, her hands trembling, her mind torn between duty and disbelief. When the night turned to dawn, the field hospital was a mosaic of exhaustion. The Americans had treated dozens of their own, amputating limbs, suturing shrapnel wounds, whispering names that would soon be sent home in telegrams. The Japanese wounded had been stabilized after, not neglected but handled in order of triage. The nurses could not reconcile it with the propaganda they'd memorized, pamphlets that painted Americans as monsters who mutilated captives. What they saw instead were young men with haunted eyes, tending to friends and enemies alike, collapsing from fatigue but refusing to stop. As the rain eased, the American commander entered the tent, a lean major with mud on his boots and a map in his hand. He surveyed the carnage quietly. When he saw the Japanese nurses still assisting, he nodded once. "Keep them working," he said to his staff. "They're doing good." It wasn't kindness alone. He knew the value of cooperation, the speed that came when even enemies worked toward the same goal, preserving life if only temporarily. The nurses exchanged glances. That simple gesture of respect carried more shock than the battle itself. Far beyond this tent, the machinery of the Pacific War ground on. American forces were now landing in the Philippines by the hundreds of thousands, pushing closer to Japan's heartland. The Empire's forces were running on fumes, supplies dwindling, morale cracking, hospitals overwhelmed. In contrast, the U.S. medical chain stretched from jungle front lines to hospital ships offshore, to bases in Guam and Hawaii, all connected by radio and transport. To Japanese eyes, it looked like an empire of mercy, as vast as their empire of conquest once had been. By late afternoon, when the last of the wounded had been moved to makeshift wards, the nurses sat quietly near the tent's edge. One of them wept, not out of fear but confusion. The enemy had upended every rule she had lived by. The Americans' willingness to save their own above all else wasn't cruelty. It was a different kind of devotion. They fought for each other. Not for the emperor, not for abstract glory, but for the man beside them. When an American medic finally slumped against a wall, his hands still red with blood, he caught Midori's eye and managed a weary half-smile. "War's hell," he muttered, "but we still patch up what's left." Those words would echo in her mind long after the guns fell silent. She would remember that in a world consumed by death, the true mystery was not why men killed, but why some still chose to save. The nurses could not yet know that this philosophy, this relentless prioritization of survival, would soon reshape modern medicine itself. From the jungles of the Pacific to the hospitals of post-war Japan, it would redefine how nations cared for their wounded, on and off the battlefield. And as night fell again over the blood-soaked island, a new question lingered in the humid air, unanswered and haunting. If mercy could exist amid such horror, what else about this enemy had they been wrong about? Dawn rose over the shattered jungles of Leyte, casting a pale, smoky light across fields that had become graveyards. The cries of the wounded faded into the hum of engines and the rhythmic clatter of typewriters in the U.S. Army's medical command tent. Here, beneath the faded canvas, war turned into arithmetic. Blood pressure, pulse rates, plasma units, morphine doses. What the Japanese nurses had witnessed that night was not an accident of kindness. It was the deliberate design of a system that treated survival as strategy. The American Medical Corps had transformed since the early days of the war. Back in 1942, medics often fought to save lives with barely any tools. Sulfur powder, crude bandages, and little else. But by 1944, the United States had built an invisible empire of logistics that extended from the factories of Chicago to the beaches of the Pacific. Blood plasma traveled in refrigerated units aboard C-47 aircraft. Surgical tools were sterilized in portable autoclaves powered by generators. Wounded men could be evacuated from the front line to hospital ships within hours. To the Japanese, who relied on manual transport and rudimentary field care, good seemed like witchcraft. At the core of this transformation stood the Army Medical Department and a legion of scientists, engineers, and industrialists. Companies like Johnson & Johnson mass-produced bandages by the millions. The Abbott laboratories refined plasma preservation techniques that kept blood viable for weeks. The engineers at the Quartermaster Corps developed collapsible stretchers, lightweight field operating tables, and even compact anesthesia machines designed to run in jungles. Every innovation added minutes to a soldier's life, and minutes often meant the difference between burial and survival. On the front lines, the men carrying those miracles were the medics. Soldiers trained not just to fight but to heal under fire. They learned to work with one hand while the other clutched a rifle. Their motto was grim and simple, so that others may live. It wasn't courage alone. It was coordination. Each division had its own medical platoons, ambulances, and evacuation teams linked by radio. When a soldier fell, a medic marked his location, radioed the field hospital, and the chain began to move. In under 30 minutes, a jeep or carrier would arrive, rushing him back through the mud to a surgeon waiting with sterilized instruments. The Japanese nurses, now working under supervision, slowly realized what they were witnessing was not chaos but choreography. The Americans weren't just saving men. They were feeding a war machine that ran on human recovery. Each man patched up and sent home alive strengthened the morale of thousands still fighting. Every limb saved was a reminder that the army would not abandon its own. Midori, the nurse from Osaka, observed this machine in motion one morning as medics unloaded stretchers from a half-track. Among them lay a Marine barely breathing, a hole torn through his chest by shrapnel. Within seconds, a medic injected morphine, another attached a plasma bottle, a third cut through his uniform. "Pressure here, clamp sutures." The words came in rhythm, almost like a prayer. Within 10 minutes, the man's heartbeat steadied. The Japanese nurses, trained to wait for orders and hierarchy, stood amazed at the autonomy each American displayed. There was no waiting for a doctor's command. Every man knew what had to be done and when. In the following days, as the Americans advanced deeper inland, the wounded kept coming. The field hospital expanded, tents rising like pale ghosts over the mud. Trucks unloaded boxes marked Medical Department, U.S. Army. Inside were rubber gloves, surgical blades, ether, penicillin, the miracle drug that would soon change the face of warfare. Invented years earlier but mass-produced only through the efforts of American chemists and British researchers, penicillin could halt infections that once killed by the thousands. For the first time in human history, a wound didn't automatically mean death. To the Japanese nurses, who had lost countless soldiers to sepsis, it seemed as though the Americans had stolen a secret from the gods. As the medics worked, the sound of artillery never stopped. Each thunderclap meant more stretchers. Midori was assigned to assist in surgery under Captain William Harkins, a soft-spoken doctor from New York. His hands moved with mechanical precision, his face expressionless. She asked through a translator why they worked so fast and so relentlessly. Harkins paused only for a moment. "Because every man here has someone waiting for him," he said. That's reason enough. For a woman raised in a culture that glorified sacrifice, the answer struck her like a blade. One afternoon, the battle outside reached a crescendo. Japanese positions hidden in the hills began a desperate counterattack. The 7th Infantry's forward platoons were pinned down under heavy mortar fire. The medics raced forward under bullets to retrieve the wounded. They carried no rifles, only Red Cross armbands and faith in a rule older than war itself, that even in hell, the act of saving life was sacred. Several were killed in the attempt. But those who returned brought back soldiers who would live to tell their story. The nurses saw this and wept quietly. They could not imagine such risk for one's own, let alone for strangers. Behind the lines, the field hospital became a microcosm of the new American doctrine: speed, efficiency, and humanity intertwined. The U.S. Army's evacuation policy demanded that no wounded man remain at the front longer than necessary. It was logistics on a grand scale: dedicated hospital trains, amphibious evacuation craft, and air ambulances, turning the Pacific into a network of mercy. Each soldier saved was a testament to planning, industry, and the faith that human life, even in war, carried measurable value. The Japanese nurses began keeping notes, sketches, and quiet records. They studied the tools, the methods, the protocols. One night, Midori wrote in her hidden notebook, "They do not fight to die. They fight to return." The difference was not in courage, but in philosophy. For the Imperial Army, sacrifice was the highest form of duty. For the Americans, survival was victory. Weeks later, during the Battle of the Burawan airfields, the same principles were tested under fire once again. When Japanese paratroopers raided American positions, chaos consumed the jungle. Planes exploded on the runway. Yet within minutes, medics established triage zones under fire. using aircraft wings as tables, parachute silk as bandages. Even as bullets tore through the air, the rhythm continued. Tag, treat, move. When the shooting finally stopped, over 200 wounded had been evacuated alive. The Japanese raiders had fought fiercely, but they lacked the means to save their own. As news of the Americans' medical efficiency spread, captured Japanese personnel began whispering among themselves. They could not comprehend a force that valued the living more than the dead. In their doctrine, honor was measured in destruction. In the American system, it was measured in endurance. By December, the field hospitals across the Philippines had become testaments to industrial medicine. Engineers designed portable X-ray units, nurses operated sterilizers built from aircraft parts, and logistics officers ensured every vial of plasma was accounted for. It was warfare redefined, not by firepower alone, but by the will to preserve life even amid annihilation. And so, as 1944 drew to a close, Midori and her fellow nurses found themselves standing in a twilight between worlds. They had come to believe that victory belonged not to the side that killed the most, but to the one that refused to let its wounded die. Yet even as they learned the mechanics of mercy, a darker question loomed. What would happen when this system of compassion met the firestorm still waiting beyond the horizon? Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and finally the homeland itself. The war moved north like a spreading fire, and by early 1945 it reached the gates of Japan itself. The lessons of Leyte had already burned into memory. American medics saving their own, Japanese nurses standing in stunned silence, but now the scale was incomprehensible. The islands ahead, Luzon, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, would become the deadliest crucibles of the Pacific. And with them came the full force of the American medical machine, the same system that had left those Japanese nurses questioning everything they'd been taught. On Iwo Jima, the volcanic ash swallowed the living and the dying alike. In February 1945, as Marines stormed the beaches under Mount Suribachi, medics once again led from the front. They carried plasma bottles in their teeth, morphine syringes in their helmets, bandages in their pockets. Japanese defenders fought to the death, often refusing capture, their tunnels collapsing around them. The American medics crawled through those same tunnels afterward, not to loot, but to pull out their wounded, gasping for air, half buried in sulfur dust. Japanese survivors who witnessed this would later speak in disbelief. These were not the demons their officers had described. They were men, bloody, broken, and still trying to save their comrades when everything else had burned away. For the Americans, the pattern was relentless. Every battle hardened their resolve, but it also refined their methods. The U.S. Army and Navy had perfected the chain of survival: aid station, field hospital, evacuation ship, base hospital. It was medicine on a conveyor belt, powered by organization and compassion. Helicopter evacuation would come later, in Korea, but its roots were here, in the litter bearers trudging through mud, the corpsmen risking sniper fire to reach a wounded man. Each link in that chain reflected the belief that no soldier was expendable. By contrast, the Japanese Medical Corps had collapsed under impossible strain. Supplies vanished. Hospitals ran out of morphine and plasma. The Imperial High Command demanded that every available resource go to the front line, leaving the wounded to die in caves or beneath bombed-out ruins. For the nurses, many of them still teenagers, it was a nightmare beyond endurance. They worked by candlelight, stitching wounds with fishing line, boiling instruments in seawater, knowing most would never wake again. And then came the moment of surrender, when the unimaginable happened. Their enemies, those same Americans they had been taught to hate, began treating their wounded instead. The philosophy behind that mercy ran deeper than any single order or doctrine. It came from a society that believed in the sanctity of the individual, where a farm boy from Kansas or a dock worker from Brooklyn mattered enough to move heaven and earth to bring him home. To the Japanese nurses, raised in the collective spirit of the emperor, it was alien. But as they watched American surgeons labor over burned and shattered bodies, something within them began to change. The act of saving life became an act of revelation. They began to understand that the strength of a nation could be measured not only by its weapons, but by how fiercely it protected its wounded. Okinawa was where that truth reached its most tragic climax. From April to June 1945, the island became a vision of hell on earth. Over 200,000 people, soldiers, civilians, medics, and nurses, would die there. The Americans built massive hospital complexes on the beaches, staffed by thousands of corpsmen and nurses. Ambulances roared day and night, carrying men whose bodies were torn apart by artillery. Above them, Navy hospital ships anchored offshore, their decks filled with the cries of the wounded. In one corner of that chaos, captured Japanese nurses worked under guard beside American personnel. They had expected hatred. Instead, they were handed clean instruments and told to help. The order was simple: save whoever's breathing. Among them was Midori. She had survived the Philippines and now found herself tending to both Japanese and American casualties. The faces blurred together, young, terrified, bleeding. She no longer saw enemies or allies, only the endless sameness of suffering. One night, as she wrapped a tourniquet around an American's leg, she realized her hands no longer trembled. Mercy had become instinct. The medic beside her, his name was Private Daniels, looked at her and nodded as if he understood the quiet transformation taking place. "We all bleed red," he murmured, before turning to the next stretcher. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945 and Japan lay in ruins, that philosophy would follow her home. In the ashes of Tokyo and Osaka, American medical teams arrived once more, not as conquerors but as healers. They brought antibiotics, training manuals, and doctors who would teach Japan's next generation how to build a modern healthcare system. Many of the Japanese nurses who had once stared in disbelief at Leyte now became the first students of this new medicine. They learned triage, sanitation, and emergency surgery, the very principles that had stunned them months before. The human cost of the war could never be undone. Millions were gone, but in the quiet aftermath, amid the ruins and ration lines, something remarkable began to grow. Former enemies found common ground in compassion. American doctors treated Japanese civilians suffering from burns and starvation. Japanese nurses joined them, their old uniforms replaced by white coats. Together they built clinics from the rubble. The same philosophy that had driven medics to risk their lives under fire now became the foundation of Japan's post-war recovery. Midori, who had once whispered that she did not understand a war where the enemy cared for its wounded, would one day teach those very methods to her own students. She told them about plasma bottles hanging from bamboo poles, about the rhythm of hands working in unison under fire, about the strange, fierce mercy that had saved so many lives. Her students listened in silence, unable to imagine such darkness or such light. She ended every lecture the same way. Compassion does not belong to any flag. It belongs to those who choose to see life as worth saving. As the years passed, the legacy of those wartime medics expanded far beyond the battlefield. Their methods shaped modern emergency medicine, trauma surgery, and evacuation systems. The golden hour they had lived by became the cornerstone of every ambulance and trauma center in the world. The chain of survival that stretched from the jungles of the Pacific to the decks of hospital ships now reached every city street and disaster zone. What began as wartime necessity became peacetime salvation. Yet the moral weight of that innovation remained. Those Japanese nurses never forgot the sight of men who treated their own with such desperate devotion. They had seen an army that wept for its fallen and celebrated its survivors. An army that believed that saving life was as noble as taking it in combat. In their eyes, the Americans' true weapon had not been the rifle, nor the bomb, but the refusal to surrender to cruelty. Decades later, as Japan rebuilt itself into a modern nation, many of those same nurses would still gather in quiet reunions. They would speak of the sounds, the groans, the rain, the clatter of instruments, and of the moment when they realized that mercy could be stronger than fear. The war had taught them destruction. Their enemies had taught them humanity, and so the story of those stunned nurses became more than a memory. It became a mirror for the world that followed. The lesson was carved into the very fabric of modern warfare and medicine alike, that in the face of unimaginable horror, compassion is not weakness. It is defiance. Because in the end, amid the ashes of two nations and the silence that followed, one truth endured: war may reveal the worst in humanity, but sometimes, in the hands of those who choose to heal instead of harm, it also reveals the best.